I'm Maya. I was always the type of person to stick to a plan, college, job, save up maybe my own little place I could call mine one day. The irony of me working in a travel agency makes you wonder. I spent around 8 hours surrounded by posters showcasing places that I never visited. It was work, home, sleep, and repeat. Bam! The next thing you know, I got a call from an old college buddy of mine, Jake. Hey Maya, long time no see. Guess what? Throwing a camping trip this weekend. The second I picked up, he blurted out, "You need to come." Yeah, but no buts, Maya. It's just a weekend. You need a break. What's the point of selling dreams if you never live one? He was pushing, knowing I'd cave. All right. Send me the details. I gave in, already regretting my decision as we hung up. But a part of me felt a spark of excitement, something I hadn't felt in a long while. The rest of the week was a blur of preparations. I dug out my old camping gear, bought some new hiking boots, my old ones were a lost cause, and by Friday, I was as ready as I'd ever be. Saturday morning arrived, chilly and clear. I drove to the meeting spot, a little coffee shop where our group was gathering before heading out. Jake was already there, larger than life, greeting everyone with boisterous hellos. He introduced me around. "This is Maya, guys. We went to college together. She's a pro at booking your dream vacation but never takes one herself." The group laughed, and I managed a tight smile. Jake was just like I remembered, always the center of attention. As we set off, the reality of what I'd signed up for hit me. The path was steeper than I expected, the backpack was killing my shoulders, and those new boots felt like a torture device. About an hour in, I was seriously questioning my life choices. That's when I noticed him. Alex. Alex was a friend of a friend, tall with an easy smile, walking alongside me. "First time hiking in a while?" he asked, eyeing my awkward steps. "Is it that obvious?" I gasped a bit. He laughed. "Here, let me help you with your pack. It'll make the climb easier." Reluctantly, I handed it over, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. "Thanks, I guess. I'm not as fit as I thought." As we walked, Alex shared stories of his own travels and misadventures. He had this easy way about him that made the hours pass faster. I found myself laughing more than I had in months. By the time we set up camp, I was exhausted but exhilarated. The evening passed with campfire stories and marshmallows. Alex stayed close, and we talked late into the night, the stars our only light. Waking up in a tent wasn't my usual start to a Sunday, but there I was with a stiff back and the chirping of birds outside. The day promised more hiking, and honestly, I was dreading it. Pulling on my boots, which were now slightly less torturous than the day before, I stepped out into the crisp morning air. Alex was already up, brewing coffee over a small camp stove. "Morning, Maya," he said with a smile as I approached. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What's that smell?" "Coffee. Thought it might help kickstart the day. Want some?" "God, yes. Thanks," I said, accepting the cup and sipping carefully. The warmth was comforting, and the caffeine started to seep into my bones. As the others began to stir, Jake called us to gather around. "All right, team. Today's trek is a bit tougher, so let's stick together, and hey, no one gets left behind." I glanced at Alex, silently pleading for him to stick close. He seemed to understand and nodded subtly. We started off at a good pace, the trail leading us through denser forest. The terrain was rough with roots and rocks that demanded attention. Alex walked beside me, offering a steady stream of conversation that kept my mind off my aching muscles. "So, Maya, what made you finally say yes to a trip like this?" he asked as we navigated a particularly tricky stretch. I laughed. Jake wouldn't stop nagging. He said I was becoming part of the furniture at the office. Guess I needed to prove him wrong. The path eventually opened up to a beautiful clearing with a view of the mountains beyond. We stopped for a break, everyone catching their breath and taking in the scenery. I dropped my pack with a thud and flopped down beside it. Alex sat down next to me, handing me a water bottle. "You're doing great, Maya." "Seriously, thanks, Alex. This is tougher than I thought. But I'm glad I came," I admitted, looking around at the natural beauty. We spent a few moments in comfortable silence, just enjoying the peace of the wilderness. It was new for me, this quiet companionship, and I found myself not wanting the moment to end. As we got up to continue, Alex offered his hand to help me up. "Ready for the next leg?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, accepting his hand. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of greenery and occasional wildlife sightings. As we packed up to head back to camp, Alex lingered behind with me. "Hey, Maya, there's a small waterfall not far from here. Want to check it out before we head back?" I hesitated, my body screaming for rest, but then I nodded. "Sure, why not? Lead the way." That little detour, just the two of us, felt like an adventure within an adventure. The waterfall was breathtaking, a hidden gem tucked away from the beaten path. Standing there, watching the water cascade down, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the raw beauty of the place, or maybe it was the person by my side, but I knew I would remember this moment for a long time. Life has a funny way of turning your plans upside down. 2 years after that camping trip, Alex and I got married. It was a simple wedding, nothing too fancy but filled with joy. Well, mostly. His mum, Mrs. Collins, stood there with her lips pinched tight, barely cracking a smile. She never thought I was good enough for her son and never missed a chance to let me know. Fast forward 3 more years, and Alex came home one day with a big idea. "Maya, we should move in with my mum. Since Dad passed, she's all alone in that big house, and I worry about her." I was chopping vegetables for dinner and almost nicked my finger with the knife. "Live with your mum? Alex, you know how she feels about me." He sighed, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "I know it's not ideal, but she's my mum. We need to look after her." The thought of living under the same roof as Mrs. Collins made my stomach turn, but I loved Alex. "Okay, we'll try it for you." The day we moved in, Mrs. Collins greeted us with a forced smile and a list of house rules she'd written down. I tried to keep things light, but the tension was thick. That evening, while Alex was setting up our bedroom, his mum cornered me in the kitchen. "Maya, I hope you understand that this is still my home. I expect certain standards to be maintained," she said, eyeing the way I was organising the pantry. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Collins," she huffed. "Please at least try to keep things clean and don't think you can just lounge around all day. There's plenty to be done." Her words stung, but I swallowed the hurt. "I'll make sure everything's up to your standards." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Living with Mrs. Collins was as tough as I had feared. She had a comment for everything I did, from the way I cooked meals, "Too spicy, Maya, not everyone likes to burn their tongue," to how I did the laundry. "You're folding those sheets all wrong." One particularly rough day, Alex came home to find me scrubbing the kitchen floor, tears of frustration welling up. "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside me. "It's just your mum. I'm trying, Alex, but it feels like she's never happy with anything I do." He wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "I'm sorry, Maya. I see how hard you're trying. Let me talk to her, okay?" The talk must have had some effect, because Mrs. Collins backed off a bit. She was still cold, but the constant criticism slowed down, slowly, very slowly. We settled into a tense routine. Then came the discussion about children. I wanted to start a family, but month after month nothing happened. I was worried and brought it up one evening while Alex and I were washing dishes. "Alex, do you think there's something wrong? Should we see a doctor?" He didn't look at me, focusing on a stubborn spot on a plate. "I don't know, Maya. Let's not rush things. These things take time." "But it's been years," I pressed, feeling the sting of tears. He put down the dish and took my hands. "Hey, let's just be patient, okay? We have a lot on our plates right now." As tough as things were, I found small ways to make that old house feel like home. I started a garden, something I'd always wanted to do. Mrs. Collins even complimented it once. though it was more of a grunt than actual praise. One afternoon, while I was pruning the roses, she came out and watched me for a few minutes. "You have a knack for this gardening thing," she remarked almost begrudgingly. I smiled, wiping sweat from my brow. "Thanks, Mrs. Collins. It's nice to hear that from you." One day, Alex asked me to quit my job, and I unexpectedly agreed, becoming a housewife. Every day was a juggle between household chores, taking care of Mrs. Collins, and dealing with the undercurrents of a changing family dynamic. Alex's behavior had started to shift too. He was staying late at work, often too tired to talk when he got home, and on many nights he just crashed in the spare room, mumbling about needing to catch up on sleep. One evening, while I was fixing a leaky faucet, Alex's sister Lydia dropped by unannounced. "Still playing the devoted wife in this dreary old tomb," Lydia sneered as she looked around the dimly lit kitchen. "It's not that bad, Lydia. It'll grow on you," I shot back, trying not to let her get under my skin. She laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "It's just like you, isn't it? Old-fashioned and lonely. Fits you perfectly." Before I could respond, she turned to her mother. "Mum, I need some money. The usual stuff, you know how it is." Without a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Collins pulled out her checkbook and wrote her a check, her hand shaky but determined. It wasn't long after Lydia's visit that Mrs. Collins's health took a turn for the worse. One afternoon, she called me into her room, her voice weaker than usual. "Maya, can you help me with my bath? I can't do it myself today." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Of course, Mrs. Collins." As I helped her, careful and gentle, her usual sharpness melted away. By the end, tears were rolling down her cheeks. "Thank you, dear. My own daughter, she won't even help me." "Don't mention it. It's okay," I said, helping her back to her room. That day marked a change in our relationship. She started treating me more like a daughter than a reluctant houseguest. But as we grew closer, Alex grew more distant. One day, I overheard him on the phone talking about an apartment he had bought near his work. Curious, I asked him about it later. "Show me the apartment sometime," I suggested, trying to keep my tone light. "It's just a regular place, Maya. Nothing to see. It's not a museum," he snapped, shutting down the conversation abruptly. His coldness stung, but what hurt more came a few days later when Mrs. Collins called me to her side, whispering with urgency. "He bought that apartment with my money, Maya. Put it in my name, even uses my savings for the bills." There, I felt my heart sink. Why would he do that? She shook her head, her eyes sad. "I don't know, dear, but be careful. There's more going on with Alex than we know." Mrs. Collins, my unlikely ally through recent tough times, had begun to see me as more than just the woman her son had married. Maybe it was the countless days spent together, or maybe it was the genuine help I showed, but she started treating me kindly, and that was new. One lazy, sunlit afternoon as we sat in the parlour, I broached a topic I'd been mulling over for weeks. "Mrs. Collins, have you ever thought about sprucing up this old place?" She looked around, her gaze lingering on peeling wallpaper and faded photographs. "I suppose it could use a bit of touching up," she admitted, her voice softening with a rare hint of nostalgia. Encouraged, I pushed forward. "I was thinking more than just touching up. What if we really changed things around, made it brighter, more lively?" She raised an eyebrow, a spark of interest in her eyes. "What did you have in mind?" "Maybe some new paint, fixing up the old furniture, getting some new curtains. It could really lighten up the place," I said, warming to the idea. Mrs. Collins nodded slowly. "That sounds nice. It's been ages since anything changed around here. Do you think you could handle that?" "I'd love to," I assured her, excitement building in my chest. The next day, armed with paint samples and fabric swatches, I set about transforming the old mansion. The work was hard, but it felt good to be doing something tangible, something that would breathe new life into these tired walls. As I was stripping wallpaper in the dining room, Mrs. Collins came in, leaning on her cane. "You're really going all out, aren't you?" she observed, watching as I scraped off layers of the past. I am, I replied, smiling despite the sweat on my brow. This place is going to feel completely different. She chuckled, a sound so rare I almost didn't recognize it. At this rate, I might not even recognize my own home. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly transformed. The dark, drab colours gave way to bright, welcoming tones. Old, musty carpets were removed, revealing beautiful hardwood floors that we polished until they shone. Alex was hardly around, his visits growing even more infrequent. But one evening, he came home as I was draping new curtains in the living room. "What the hell is all this? What have you done to my house?" he demanded, his eyes darting around the changed space. At that moment, Mrs. Collins entered the room. "It's my house, Alex. I want it to be nice. Ma is doing a wonderful job." Alex looked between us, his frustration palpable. "Fine," he snapped, before stomping off to other parts of the house. Despite his reaction, we pressed on. Mrs. Collins and I picked out new furniture, replacing the old heavy pieces with lighter, more modern choices that still respected the house's character. Every new addition seemed to lift her spirits and mine too. Life had just started settling down after the renovation when Mrs. Collins's health took a sudden turn for the worse. One morning, I found her slumped over in her chair, barely able to speak. The panic button was hit, and within hours we were in the emergency room where doctors buzzed around her, finally declaring she'd suffered a stroke. She was whisked away for treatment, and I found myself pacing the sterile, cold hallways of the hospital alone. Alex didn't show up, neither did Lydia. Mrs. Collins spent a couple of weeks in the hospital, but it was only me who visited every day. I'd sit by her bedside, holding her hand, talking about the house, trying to keep her spirits up while she stared blankly at the walls. Her body was weak, her spirit weaker. When she was finally discharged, she was a shell of her former self, confined to her bed. Her movements were slow and her speech slurred. It was on that first day back at home when Alex and Lydia decided to show their faces. They walked past me in the hallway straight to Mrs. Collins's room, where they began discussing her assets as though she wasn't lying right there. "Mum's got that savings account. We should look into that," Lydia was saying, flipping through some papers she shouldn't have had. "Yeah, and the house. We need to start thinking about what to do with it," Alex chimed in, not even trying to lower his voice. Mrs. Collins's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling. Seeing her so vulnerable broke my heart. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Can you two stop? She's right here listening to all this." Alex turned on me, his face twisted in annoyance. "This is family business, Maya. Stay out of it." Lydia scoffed. "Yeah, just because you play nurse doesn't mean you have a say." Their words stung, but I wasn't about to let them bully me or her. "She is my family too, and I'm not going to let you two treat her like this." From that day on, I threw myself into caring for her. I read up on stroke recovery, learned exercises to help her regain mobility, and massaged her limbs to keep them from stiffening. Slowly, she started responding. It was painstaking and slow, but progress was made. She began eating on her own, a stubborn set to her jaw whenever she'd attempt to walk with my support. Alex and Lydia watched this recovery with thinly veiled dismay. It seemed every step forward for Mrs. Collins was a step away from whatever plans they'd concocted for her assets. One evening, as I helped Mrs. Collins back into bed after a particularly strenuous set of exercises, she looked up at me with more clarity than I'd seen in weeks. "Thank you, Maya," she murmured, her voice still weak but determined. "You're my real family." It had been a peaceful year in some ways, the mansion slowly feeling more like a home under my care. That peace shattered the morning I found Mrs. Collins passed away in her sleep. It was a quiet exit, fitting for the gentle side of her I'd come to know. The funeral was a surreal blur. I was greeting mourners in the parlour, still in a daze, when Alex walked in. The shock came not just from seeing him. He'd been increasingly absent over the past year, but from the woman who accompanied him, holding a toddler with another child tugging at her skirt. "This is my wife, Linda, and these are my children." Alex introduced them without a flinch. His words cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. Then he turned to me, his voice cold and sharp. "Maya, you need to leave. We'll be moving in." I stood there, stunned, trying to process his words when Lydia's laughter broke through my shock. Finally, this house will see some proper life again. Before I could respond, the notary, Mr. Hanson, called us together for the reading of the will. We moved into the living room, a heavy tension settling over us. Mr. Hanson opened his briefcase, pulling out the documents. "Let's proceed with the reading of Marjorie Collins's last will and testament." Alex and Lydia positioned themselves prominently, as if ready to claim their victory. I remained standing by the window, feeling the weight of the moment. "I, Marjorie Collins, declare this my last will and testament," Mr. Hanson read. "To Maya, who has been more than a daughter to me, I leave all my property, including the mansion and all my financial assets. Furthermore, the apartment purchased by my son Alex will also revert to Maya, as it was acquired with funds provided by me." The silence that followed was palpable. Alex's face turned red, his fists clenched. "This is ridiculous. You must have forced her into this, Maya." Lydia was quick to join in, her voice harsh and accusing. "You're nothing but a gold digger. Mum was old and confused. You took advantage of her." I felt my heart pounding, but I kept my calm. "I didn't force anyone. I cared for her when you wouldn't." Mr. Hanson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "There is also a video statement from Marjorie, if you will," he said, setting up a laptop. The screen flickered and Mrs. Collins appeared, looking frail but resolute. "If you are hearing this, I am no longer here. I have left everything to Maya. In these past years, she has shown me kindness, compassion, and loyalty more than my own children ever did. This is my thank you to her, my final wish." The room was silent as the video ended. Alex looked as if he might explode with fury, while Lydia seemed to shrink, her earlier bravado evaporating. Alex turned to Mr. Hanson, his voice desperate. "We can contest this, right? There's got to be a way." Mr. Hanson closed the folder with a snap. "You can try, but Marjorie was of sound mind when she made these decisions. Everything is legally binding." After everything settled down, the first thing I did was finalize my divorce from Alex. The house, the apartment where he'd set up his little fantasy life, they were all legally mine now. Alex ended up drifting with his new family, bouncing from one rental to another. I heard about it from mutual friends, the whispers of his downfall circulating back to me, but I didn't take any pleasure in it. Lydia, too, had her own set of troubles. After betting on inheriting her mother's money and losing, she was swamped with debt. One afternoon, she showed up at my doorstep, her face haggard, her usual brashness gone. "Maya, I need help," she said straight out, no beating around the bush. "I've got nothing left." I looked at her, remembering all the harsh words, the sneers. "I can't help you, Lydia. You made your choices." She stared at me, a mix of anger and desperation in her eyes. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching us fall apart?" I shook my head, feeling a twinge of pity despite everything. "I don't enjoy any of this, Lydia, but you need to sort out your own mess." I decided to transform the old mansion into a small private hotel for tourists, calling it Marjorie's in memory of Mrs. Collins. It seemed fitting to honour her this way, keeping her love for the house alive by filling it with life and laughter again. I managed everything from renovations to marketing, pouring my heart into every detail, making sure that everything was perfect. One evening, sitting in the garden Mrs. Collins loved so much, I allowed myself to really think about the future. I planned expansions, special events, community activities. Marjorie's was not just going to be a hotel, it was going to be a vital part of the community, a place that brought people together.